Hello and welcome back to the rise and fall of the Chill Out Room, a history of ambient house and ambient techno 1989 to 1996. We are well into 96 now, the final year, and today we're looking at some labels. Emit slowed down their release rate a little for 96, but more notably diversified even further than ever before. Lucid Dreams 0096 is a broadly spoken word album by Celia Green, psychologist, philosophist and expert on lucid dreaming and out-of-body experiences. In the background are abstract soundscapes and textural ambient collages by Bad Data and Miasma. Some of the music's pretty cool, but the speech is intentionally the focus here. Listen and learn, if you're interested. A very niche recording, but one that has some passionate fans. I did have to laugh at a Discogs reviewer who bought the Astral Industries 2LP reissue and complained that there was too much talking on it. Do people genuinely not read the blurb or listen to clips before listening? That said, full marks to Astral Industries for actually including all the tracks this time. Well done guys, you finally understand how albums work. Student and composer of electroacoustic and experimental music since the 70s, Carl Stone is not the first person you jump to when looking for artists to release on an ambient label, but this score released on Emit does have its ambient moments, with the first movement being largely warm drone before the banging percussion and jazz loops take over. Undark 3396 is a solo album from Russell Mills, a designer with a lot of classic covers behind him, Eno's Thursday Afternoon and The Pearl among them. For his album here, a lot of odd and slightly clashing ideas are brought together. Dark ambience, industrial hip-hop beats, gentle guitar-led trip-hop, classical chamber music, folk song, and somehow they work. With a broad lineup including contributions from Bill Laswell, Brian and Roger Eno, U2 guitarist The Edge, Robin Guthrie, Kevin Shields, David Sylvian and Emit's Miasma, it's unsurprisingly immaculately written and performed, and it's rare you'll find such big names on an ambient record from the 90s. As with the Miasma album, I'd describe this as post-ambient house, a record that uses the style's sound collage, down-tempo and ambient mix, and takes it away from the chill-out rooms and clubs into brand new territories. Marvellous and original music. With fewer releases, there was only time for one compilation in 96, 2296, featuring the wonderful Gas exclusive Vapornaut, More Beat System, whose album would follow soon after, a work of pure field recording from Dallas Simpson, as well as a number of the usual down-tempo pieces. Instinct would later release the Emit Explorer compilation drawn from various albums and compilations from the label. Facts were still going strong, but even Namlook's Little Empire wasn't immune to the downturn in ambience fortunes, with the number of releases halving between 95 and 96. The biggest casualty was the sub-label, dedicated to music not featuring Namlook himself, which only released 2 albums in the whole year. Most of the 96 releases featured Pete recording with already familiar collaborators. By this point, the direction of the label was definitely heading back towards beats. IDM, house, techno, and breaks all feature as often as ambient. There are still a number of albums that could have come from the golden age of ambient techno, however. The Dark Side of the Moog brought in Bill Laswell to add his own unique style, and the resulting 2 albums, 4 and 5, feature some great ideas, even if the 5th does feature this cover in its 1998 Ambient World reissue. The late 90s was a bad era for Facts artwork. Volume 4 features 3 pipers at the Gates of Dawn, one of the better Floyd puns, and opens with dramatic sampled strings. It's very unfax and honestly really enjoyable. The second part is a 20-minute sequencer workout, the most authentically Berlin school sounding in the DATacide catalogue so far, with some jar-esque soloing, and it's just really a great piece of space music. After the usual abstraction, including spoken voices, we get the second upbeat piece, this time joined by pounding techno rhythms, and then some rather beautiful guitar improv over gorgeous ambient drones. And then the techno comes back. It's pleasingly chunky after the sometimes slightly dated trance sounds Namlook had been known to employ at this point. Laswell's bass no doubt helps a great deal. The 5th volume, Psychedelic Brunch, opens with a brief introduction from Robert Moog. You just couldn't mispronounce your name for the sake of a pun, could you, Robert? It's not a single-hour composition at all this time, instead a number of individual pieces. Already gets a bonus point from me. Part 3 is perhaps the best, a chunky mid-tempo track that throws in beats without the need for 140 BPM trance. Schultz's sequencing, Namlook's ambient techno textures and Laswell's dub bass combining to create an incredibly memorable track that's one of the real highlights of the DATacide series. Mellotron adds some 70s authenticity. For some very enjoyable variety, we then get acoustic percussion, the likes of which were previously heard on Namlook's Air releases. Yes, this truly is an attempt to take the sound developed over the earlier volumes and apply it to a more developed canvas. For those like myself who prefer more concise compositions brought together to make a varied but coherent album, this volume is a blessing as it shows off the depth and diversity this group of artists are capable of. Looking for ways to expand himself beyond the usual kinds of collaboration, and even the most staunch fact defender must acknowledge that by mid-96 there were a lot of projects operating in very similar sonic territory, Namlook reached out to renowned Turkish musician Burhan Özal to recreate a new project called Sultan. The result is an album that reaches deeper into the ethno-tribal end of 90s electronic music than most went, and some wonderfully authentic pieces alongside occasionally quite bizarre mashups. The first piece, Yenilik, is split into 9 parts or 8 parts depending whether you believe the sleeve or the CD indexing. Here we get what I believe is oud as the source of a wonderfully atmospheric opening, followed by Middle Eastern percussion overlaid with doomy synths. Don't do a solo, Pete. Please don't. Oh, he's gone and done a solo. Bless him. Don't think there's even a wrong note here. Part 4 is the centrepiece with energetic baglama playing, joined by IDM pulses and then plenty more percussion. Özal then starts singing and things get incredibly evocative. So a genuinely strange mix of sounds, but somehow it works, and perhaps the complete authenticity in the Turkish element stops it from feeling novelty. The 20-minute Gelgor Beni Ask Naildi, I can't speak Turkish, don't expect accuracy, is different, with less of an attempt to simply play the two aspects of the music alongside each other, instead coming up with pure ambient music that incorporates the Turkish elements as part of its texture, including spoken word. It's a haunting soundscape that's just as successful as the first piece in creating images of Middle Eastern nightscapes, just in a very different way. Tremendous stuff. The album was also released in Turkey on the Arda Music label in 97, as well as in Czechia and bizarrely Germany on the Next Era label in 98, before being reissued twice by Ambient World. Namlook and Laswell's second Outland album, a single composition called African Virus, electronic sonata with a cold loved by nature, once again features recordings from distant shores, this time, unsurprisingly, West African. Here the traditional musics don't mix with the drones very well, but fear not, for Namlook and Laswell have got some beats up their sleeve. The more overtly techno-y nature of Part 3 makes it sound a little bit like the slightly naffer versions of Sultan. Part 5 is interesting, percussive hits shooting all over the stereo field while field recordings play in the background. Part 6 is a gorgeously bleak synth piece that sails away with an unnerving air. At this point, the hour-long improvisations were becoming far less common, and once again this is 6 distinct compositions rather than a single extended track. There's a shared sound, but they're maybe slightly too disparate to work consistently. An album with some very good tracks, and some less good tracks with good ideas. On the second Jet Chamber album, Uwe Schmidt and Pete Namlook hit their stride after the tentative explorations of the debut. This is IDM through and through, Schmidt's rhythm programming once again proving he's one of the unsung forward-thinking greats and remains unfairly overlooked, Namlook's presence meaning these tracks stretch out to the 20-minute mark each time. In a rotation has some gorgeous synth work, pure Namlook. Calm boxes, he sounded a particle collider, all tense drones and awe mixed with burbles, stabs, bleeps and slashes of sound, until the weird trancey synth comes in around the 17-minute mark. Out of rotation might as well be solo Schmidt, pure glitch IDM. A remarkable album that sounds like it came from 98 rather than 96, and highly recommended to anyone who's up for ambient IDM. For the third 2350 Broadway album, Inoue and Namlook also follow the trend away from CD-length improvisation to create 4 distinct compositions. Here the pair flesh out the pieces more than before too, with twinkling minimalist sequences and field recordings, especially on Rich Dreams, which is gently driving Berlin School space music, and a tremendous track in its own right. My favourite of the series, the duo were clearly going from strength to strength, although it'll be some time before a 4th volume will come along. Namlook and Inoue also found time to start yet another project. This is their last, I promise. Time². Despite the wonky techno of brief opener bypass mood, this is once again ambient, and it feels like Inoue is leading here. Unlike the usual deep analogue synth chords, here we're in field recording territory, much like on World Receiver, tons of reverb, quiet digital sounding pads, layers of found sound. Highly atmospheric, albeit a very new kind of ambient. Things head into weird clattering ambient techno on the discordant album closer, which has been given the title I've Got Chillness Illness. Is this a piss take? I have no idea. Namlook had been experimenting with cover art on his PK releases, solo and those recorded with fellow German artists, since the start of 94, with the classic circle cover appearing only occasionally since, but Time² would be the first non-PK release to feature a different art style. The original circle would soon be abandoned almost entirely. The final of the pair's 96 trilogy, and the last in its own trilogy, Shades of Orion 3 almost brings the Namlook-Inoue collaborations to an end, with only 2007's 2350 Broadway 4 remaining. Inoue would put out a couple of other albums on Fax in the meantime, but perhaps with his own electro-acoustic sound beginning to flourish, he felt more suited to working with more overtly experimental labels. Tzadik, C74 and 12K would be among those he would patronise over the next decade, the latter a release in collaboration with Taylor Dupree. Shades of Orion 3 is an oddity with clattering, heavily reverberated rhythms used a lot, as well as the usual spacey drones, and once again Inoue's digitally manipulated field recordings. It's a bit of a jarring combination, and it easily stands out as my least favourite of the pair's work together. Futuristic Detroit techno is the style of the day from Ozoona, maybe not so much of a surprise given it's a one-off collaboration with Warp Records co-founder Robert Gordon. Gordon was present for the label's early success, and that mix of techno, electro and bleep is very much present here, but don't be fooled, Namlook throws in a ton of ambience that makes it a very blissful chill-out listen. Except the closing track The Hunt, which is 180 BPM IDM thrown through every filter and effects unit in Namlook's studio. In the liner note he writes, "Most of you might hate the track, but on the other hand I assume you like me for not tailoring my music to your taste." Fair play, Pete. We also get Blackbird in the middle of the album, recorded at Namlook's window, and as the Blackbird song is my favourite sound in the world, I'm always happy to hear it. I'm convinced Pete's soloing is inspired by its song. In contrast, Namlook's collaboration with Dandy Jack under the name Amp featured more contemporary techno and punchy electro sounds, no ambient required. Inoue and Schmidt's final DATacide album, Ondas, abandons ambient entirely for a bonkers sound collage of glitch, murky melodies, jazz, spoken word, field recordings and Schmidt's growing electro-Latino sound. One of the longest running projects on Fax was the series of improvised collaborations by David Mufang and Pete Namlook. The pair had created a couple of odd jazz experiments in '95 under the name Cool Fang, but the first of 23 albums, simply credited to Move D and Namlook, was released in '96. There's a gorgeous ambient techno opener, but after that the pair are working in house territory, stripped back, occasionally funky, often quite minimal house. The disc works brilliantly as an album, with what seems like 5 separate compositions turning out to be a single long improvised track with recurring themes and melodies. The moment the sequence from the opening track reappears at the end is utterly joyous. Built from a much longer, almost day-long improvisation, this was then cut down to create a concise album. It's an unusual way of constructing what is effectively a dance music record, but it's very impressive. On his own, Namlook released only one volume in his self-titled series, with volume 11 passing Airwhales, a Berlin concert that features a lovely 13-minute segment of synth ambience in part 8. He also released a rare conventionally named album, Atom, a collection of electro tracks, and Electronic Music Center, a collection of experiments that combines the avant-garde with techno beats. Amazingly, How to Ruin a Song with a Special Sound doesn't create that bloody awful buzzing noise he used regularly in the early 90s. Most notably, he also brought back the Air project after a year away with Air 3. Breaking from the format of the first 2 albums, this volume, subtitled Secret Heritage, instead offers us 4 lengthy compositions which don't merge together. If ever a Fax album seemed designed for vinyl, it was this. Inauguration opens with fairly typical Namlook analogue chords, over which there comes live drum improvisation, calling back to his time as a jazz musician. We starts with percussion and some quiet pads, suggesting this may head into silence territory. Instead, however, we get much tougher beats followed by some stringed instrument improvisation and then overtone singing. It's ethno-ambient without much of the ambient. Est ce que l'amour fait mal throws together the 2 styles, tropical jazz percussion, guitar strums and piano improv, with Middle Eastern string melodies and the familiar Air French spoken word. The whole track falls closer to jazz fusion than ambient. The 3-part Give Space a Trance closes out the album and finally brings back the electronics, opening with gentle nocturnal pads before taking us into Berlin School territory with pulsing sequences before techno beats arrive. Previous Air albums switched between jazz, tribal, ambient and trance back and forth, from track to track over the course of the record. For the 3rd album, each particular style of the project is given its own lengthy standalone exploration. Personally, this makes it feel ever so slightly contrived, and it just doesn't flow in the way those earlier records do. Nevertheless, the actual contents are excellent with typically brilliant ideas. While for many, '96 was a year for change, for Fax it was more of a refinement. I honestly find Namlook himself a very patchy artist, but I always admired his dedication to moving forward and to challenging himself, leaving behind the trancey elements of the label's sound and improving the IDM elements, gradually phasing out the album-length improvisation in favour of more concise compositions, and putting a greater emphasis on more experimental collaborative records. Namlook slowly reshaped Fax's sound release by release to suit a post-chill-out room world without resorting to just signing up a bunch of trip-hop and future jazz artists to make him look contemporary. For me, 96 is a much more consistent year than 95, with a smaller number of albums, each with much more care put into it. As ever, there were a number of releases from lesser known artists and labels in 96, although again far fewer relevant ones. Without the framing story of the development of labels or artists, there are relatively few records I can conceivably cover here without simply pointing out that they're IDM, trip-hop, drum and bass or techno, and thus, although containing a couple of mellow tracks, aren't really the same. Everybody's Neighbour by Foundland. This is warm, inviting ambient, field recordings, vocal snippets and various instruments used over the top of enjoyably textured synth work. Beats touch on IDM but without the sparse coldness of a lot of IDM records, also verging on dub at times. Moments of spoken words, some very memorable melodies, occasional folk tunes, the whole thing combines to create a very rich soundscape that brings to mind the work of Another Fine Day. A real obscurity, but one that's worth tracking down. It appears on streaming services as Foundland by Arne Johansson. Microcosm by Alien Mutation vs Indigo Egg. This is the first appearance of Jake Stevenson and Matt Hillier. Stevenson was best known for his Goa Psytrance releases as Shamanic Tribes on Acid, while Hillier would go on to form Ishq. The pair of them spent most of the late 90s filling out Psytrance compilations for Rumour Records and Jumpin' and Pumpin' under a huge range of aliases, but here they created a one-off album of proto-Ambient. Indeed, while there are overt Psy elements here, the album actually takes in various elements of other 90s ambient, such as the tribal rhythms of Another Trip in the Forest and Journey to Ixtland, field recordings, spoken word and gentle ambient techno beats. Cloud hopping heads into trance territory, but the rest is very much in line with the exotic sounding ending of ambient techno, and the mix of dense production with swirling synths is pretty impressive. It was reissued on text in 2015 with a bonus disc of material from the same era. Divination, Distill. For the third Divination album, Bill Laswell abandoned the band format and commissioned a group of musicians to each record a track to be compiled together into a full-length work. It's a typically varied collection of musicians, although tonally quite consistent, so works from Tetsuo Inoue and a rare outing away from Fax from Pete Namlook sit alongside similarly isolationist drones from the likes of Paul Schutz and Thomas Kona. Only the tribal beats of Hiromi Hosono's Ether vibes are reminiscent of the project's earlier ambient dub leanings. Surface 10's self-titled debut starts off with a mix of Berlin School and Tech House, but also features a number of heavily atmospheric pieces, sometimes beatless, which give the album a sense of ambience. One of a number of semi-obscure electronic artists Hypnotic managed to find somewhere for their own slightly odd catalogue of ambient-adjacent music. TV Victor, Trancology Chapter 1. After the epic minimal ambient dub of his three-part Trance Garden series, Udo Heitfield's follow-up condenses the style down to a single disc of down-tempo ambient music. Quiet, gently down-tempo beats, some mellow trancey arpeggios, it's all very restrained but the contents are all lovely. New composers, Astra, an early ambient recording from this Russian duo. A collection of 17 miniatures that vary from trip-hop to field recording based ambient, experimental synth to ethno-fusion, ambient jazz to skeletal IDM. I always feel this would work a lot better if it was properly collaged together rather than feeling like a collection of disparate pieces. Nevertheless, it's a striking and original work. Toires, Hemisphere. Ethno-fusion ambient techno from French DJ and producer Florian Serio, featuring elements of electronic dub, hints of Psy melodies, the usual kind of thing. Not top draw, but creates some convincing atmospheres and worth a listen for those who have explored all the obvious routes. Ecosystem, Headland. A Fax-style mix of ethno-drone, ambient trance and soft synth improv, Headland sounds conventional but has a touch of experimentalism around the edges that makes it an inviting listen despite none of the ingredients offering anything drastically new. Neotropic, 15 Levels of Magnification. Riz Maslin met the future sound of London through mutual acquaintance Hamish MacDonald and they hit it off. She claimed to have learned a lot from watching them work and their use of sampling very clearly rubbed off on her, with some very FSOL sounds on her debut album as Neotropic. Ostensibly a trip-hop album, it was released on Entone and actually sits comfortably alongside the other Breaks Ambient crossover albums on the label like Journeyman's Mammoth 6. While many tracks slide in among the urban paranoia of much trip-hop, there are also some wonderfully 94-95 style ambient techno pieces here. The light, clicky Laundry Part 3, the uplifting and dreamy La Sentinela, Laundry Part 1's gloomy drones and field recordings, the pensive chords and light breakbeats of Electric Bud, and the tropical chill-out of Neotropic. Two real highlights are at the end. Alu Gobi is a stunning atmospheric ambient techno piece that would fit in on Efferswell's Lifeforms, while Frozen Hands records the sci-fi utopias of Reload and Global Communication. Bridging the rawer sounds of trip-hop and the atmospherics of ambient techno, 15 Levels of Magnification is a really wonderful album, and one may be occasionally overlooked due to its link to the non-ambient Ninja Tune sound. A produce, Inscape and Landscape. Barry Craig recaptures a hint of his roots in the industrial scene on the more lo-fi sound of Inscape and Landscape, but the evocative melodies here will still no doubt appeal to ambient house fans. The haunting and evocative Mystic Circle is one of his finest pieces. Nurse with Wound, Who Shall I Turn to Stereo? Not an obvious choice for this series, but go with me on this one. Who Shall I Turn to Stereo is essentially a 50-minute album-length remix of two golden microphones from the previous Nurse with Wound album, Rock and Roll Station, itself a remix of material from 1992's Thunder Perfect Mind. At this point the focus was on a tribal drum loop, one Biosphere had also used on the unreleased 1991 track Avenue 2.3, but instead of going down the usual droning route of most post-industrial tribal ambient, Stephen Stapleton and Colin Potter instead went the other way and fleshed this out into an exotic psychedelic trip, covered in field recordings, samples of other music, weird creaking noises, endless bizarre spoken inserts, eastern sounding vocals, a bit of fuzzy guitar improv. Stapleton at least was totally unaware of ambient house, but this comes across much like a dark, slightly twisted Nurse with Wound take on the style. If you feel you're up to creepy ambient house that features pitch-shifted cartoon voices announcing Springs Can Sing and Anything at one point, you're in for a treat. Yoshiaki Ochi, Aqua. Japanese style ambient, the kind of thing that was around a lot in the 80s, digital major key synth twinkles and drones, water samples, that throws in some tribal and ethnic elements. There are some reused presets and a NAF track with steel drums that knock a couple of points off, but a good one for those who like the ambient friendly and major key. Dilate, Cyclos. Pleasant space ambient drift, Namlook and Anoe style that bursts into some tribal drumming right at the end. An unusual oddity. And that's about it. But before I go, it's probably worth a peek at some of the big names that replaced ambient house and ambient techno. Ambient dub, psy-dub, psy-chill, psy-ambient, psy-trance. This was a direction in which many of the hippier, druggier aspects of ambient house went. 96 saw a growth in electronic dub and psy releases including Astralasia, The Space Between, Dub Squad, Dub in Ambient, Jar Wobble, Heaven and Earth, Mystery of the Yeti, Ashes, Corpus, Juju Space Jazz, Head Over Heels in dub, Legion of Green Men, Spatial Specific, Fluid, Bifidus Acidophilus and Other Beneficial Cultures, Possession, Off-World 1, Sacred System, Chapter 1, Book of Entrance, Hemisphere, Tread In, and many more. There was also the development of IDM. After the head blender of Hangable Autoball, Aphex Twin released the Richard D. James album, which, with its self-portrait photo and equivalent title, was as far from the faceless abstraction and otherworldly voyages of ambient as it came. The music was a massive development, taking the drill and bass sound of late 95 and making it even more complex, removing all remaining traces of jungle and throwing on top a load of gorgeous, friendly, major key, even poppy melodies, sometimes childish, sometimes euphoric. For all its harsh beats and ludicrously complex programming, this was defiantly human, down-to-earth, even silly music. His collaboration with Mike Paradinas, expert knob twiddlers, doubled down on the fun and whimsy. This dry, knowingly offbeat style became the go-to approach for electronic producers in the late 90s, be they trip-hop, IDM or big beat, especially in the UK. Alpha 7 released an album of very slightly loungy IDM called Great Lift Journeys of Norwich and Other Stories. Howie B's Music for Babies is not aiming to help your baby have an inner voyage. The likes of Global Goons signed to Reflex and built on this sound. Even artists like Spooky began to create complex IDM music. Others, like Boards of Canada, combined IDM with trip-hop, themselves going on to create one of the most beloved downbeat IDM albums in 1998 with a blend of stripped-back repetition and nostalgic melodies. Oval took things one step further with 94 Discount, experimenting with new sounds afforded by digital playback system of compact discs and inadvertently creating the modern glitch movement in the process. Pansonic and Mika Vaino's O took minimal techno to its extreme. Wolfgang Voigt began his lauded minimal ambient techno project Gas. Porter Ricks would release Biokinetics, and the Basic Channel label was running, inventing dub techno, a sound which would gradually become more ambient and become the go-to sound for ambient techno artists in the first years of the 21st century. Square Pusher released his debut on Reflex, bringing the jungle back into drill and bass and showing off his virtuoso jazz skills at the same time, unafraid of being a live performer in a heavily programmed world. In the US, the post-rock ambient crossover brought about the shoegaze trip-hop of Bowery Electric's Beat and the lo-fi guitar-based drone of Windy and Carl. Labels like Cranky would become America's biggest source of ambient for the next 10 years. Seafeel recorded an album for Reflex, and it turned out to be all dark ambient drone. They would break up soon after. John Beltran embraced Aphex Twin like IDM. Beaumont Hannon formed Outcast and fully embraced trip-hop before legal issues with GPR sapped his will to work within the music industry anymore, and he retired. Species of Fishes decided they preferred to make harsh experimental techno than ambient. Two German record labels decided things just weren't experimental enough. Millet Plateau concluding American minimal techno was just way too maximal, and Rastanoton deciding that music in general was just too maximal, the pair helping define a new era of extreme minimalism, by the turn of the century putting out albums of little more than discrete electronic tones and techno made from the thinnest shards of sound. Virgin's so-called Ambient series published compilations of post-rock, drum and bass tinged dub and jazz funk. In the UK, the Prodigy and the Chemical Brothers both got to number 1, the year ended with Orbital's re-recording of Satan at number 3, and Fatboy Slim was working his way up from semi-obscurity to become a chart-dominating plunderphonic artist, hiding behind a cutout of a fat guy. Big Beat was here, and with its use of loud drums, regular guitar samples and vocalists, frequently from rock and indie bands, it became the first electronic style to truly make a mainstream crossover with fans of guitar music. This wasn't the bunch of fey indie kids discovering ecstasy and becoming acid house fans for a couple of years. At the start of the decade, the biggest names in non-club electronica were now popular with the same beer-swilling lads who chanted along with Don't Look Back in Anger. And if you mention ambient or chill-out music, well, this is what you'd be talking about. Ambidelic Space, Ambient Chill Out Collection, Ambient Space Trip, Ambience, Ambient Earth, Ambient Moods, 17 atmospheric moods, Chill Out Free, Alien Ambient Galaxy, Ambient Extractions, Iced Up, the Stoned Cold Chill Out Session, Ambient Blues, Ambient Ibiza, Alien Bass Soundscapes, Dub Chill Out, Chill Out 2, Sunset House, Pure Ambient, Girls Ambient Pop, Shades of Flower Has Early Existence, Paradigm Ambient Hits Collection, a tribute to the hits of Amy Grant. It was official. Ambient was uncool. This all feels a very long way from the start of this series. Just over half a decade passed, and in that time, what started as a couple of daftons playing NASA samples over Pink Floyd and dub reggae in a London nightclub's VIP room went on to become one of the main driving forces behind what now existed as IDM, minimal techno, microsound, psydub and psychill, trip-hop, isolationism, drill and bass and big beat. Sure, there were many other influences involved, but it's fair to say that without the KLF, the Orb, FSOL, Global Communication, Beyond, Fax, Instinct Ambient, Emmet, Apollo, Silent, Rising High and everyone else, the electronica scene in 1996 would have been unrecognisably different. Hell, maybe Eurodance would be the big thing. As it was, we'd have to wait until at least 1999 for that to happen again. And that's all for today. Thank you for listening. We have now completed the main run of this series up to the end of 96. Next time it'll be the final episode, and I'll be looking at the legacy of ambient house and ambient techno, having a brief overview of what's happened from 97 right through to today, so please do join me then.